When people talk about weddings, they often speak of love, laughter, and happy tears, but no one ever tells you about the moments that change your life in ways you never expected. That day, my son Daniel was getting married, and the whole world seemed wrapped in joy. The church was filled with flowers, their soft fragrance mingling with the quiet hum of people chatting. I remember sitting in the front pew, holding my little grandson Liam's hand while the music played and thinking, this is it, my boy finally found his happiness. Daniel had been through so much in life after his father passed away. When he was just a teenager, he took on the role of a man too early. He worked 2 jobs to help me keep our small house running, and even then he still found time to make me laugh when he met Jessica. I thought maybe life was finally giving him a bit of peace. She was young, smart, and full of energy, the kind of woman who could light up a room. When she walked in, she treated Liam like her own, and that made me love her too. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. Jessica walked down the aisle with a smile that could melt stone, and Daniel looked at her as if he had been waiting his whole life for that very moment. I held back tears, thinking of how proud his father would have been to see him standing there, strong, kind, and ready for the next chapter in his life. After the ceremony, we all moved to the reception hall. It was a lovely place with white drapes, fairy lights, and a long table set with crystal glasses and silver plates. I sat beside Liam while Daniel and Jessica greeted everyone. I remember thinking how grown up my grandson looked in his little suit. His hair neatly combed, his eyes wide and curious. Halfway through the dinner, Liam tugged at my sleeve. I looked down and saw that serious look he gets whenever he's about to say something important. He leaned close and whispered, "Grandma, look under the table." My heart skipped a beat. I thought he was just being playful, so I smiled and whispered back, "What do you mean, sweetheart?" He said again more firmly, "Look under the table right now, please." Something in his voice made me pause. It wasn't mischief this time, it was worry. I bent a little, pretending to fix my napkin, and slowly lifted the tablecloth. My eyes adjusted to the dim light and I froze. There was a small folded note taped underneath the table just below where Jessica was sitting. My hands trembled. As I reached for it, I peeled it off and unfolded it quietly. The handwriting was messy, almost hurried. It said, "If you love your son, tell him to check his accounts before it's too late." I felt the blood drain from my face. I folded the note quickly and slipped it into my purse, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. I glanced at Liam, who was watching me with wide eyes, and whispered, "Did you see who put this here?" He nodded and said softly, "Miss Jessica dropped it." I saw her look around before she sat down. I could barely focus on the rest of the evening. I smiled when people spoke to me, nodded at jokes I didn't hear, and clapped when the couple had their first dance. But inside I was shaking. My mind raced with questions. Who wrote that note? Why would someone leave it there? And what did they mean by "before it's too late"? When the party was over and everyone was saying their goodbyes, I pulled Liam close and whispered, "Don't tell anyone about the note, sweetheart. Not even your dad. Okay?" He nodded obediently and I kissed the top of his head. My brave little boy always trusted me without question. That night when I got home, I sat at the kitchen table and took out the note again. I stared at it under the yellow lamplight. The handwriting was strange, unfamiliar, yet there was something haunting about the way the words were written, as if the writer was desperate. I thought about Jessica and how nervous she had looked at moments during the reception, how she kept checking her phone, how her smile never quite reached her eyes. Something was wrong. I hardly slept a wink that night. I kept replaying everything. In my head, the whisper from my grandson, the note, the strange tension I had felt during the evening. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just a prank, but deep down I knew better. A mother knows when something is off, and my heart told me something dark was hiding beneath all that celebration. The next morning I called my friend Clara. She's been like a sister to me for 30 years, the kind of woman who tells you the truth even when you don't want to hear it. I told her about the note. Every word she listened carefully. Then said, "Maggie, maybe it's nothing, but maybe it's everything. Don't ignore it." She suggested I talk to Daniel, but I couldn't bring myself to ruin his happiness. Not yet, he had just gotten married. I didn't want to shatter that so soon. Instead, I decided to quietly keep my eyes open. I started paying attention to Jessica's behavior over the next few weeks, and slowly pieces began to fall into place. She was always on her phone, whispering in another room. She became defensive whenever Daniel mentioned money, and once I caught her crying in the car outside the house when she thought no one was watching. One evening, Daniel came over for dinner with Liam, but Jessica didn't come. He said she wasn't feeling well and was resting at home. I tried to keep the conversation light, but I could see the tiredness in his eyes. He told me he was working extra hours to keep up with expenses because lately the accounts weren't adding up. My heart clenched at those words. I wanted to scream right then and there, "Son, check your accounts before it's too late." But I stayed silent. After he left, I went to my room and sat there thinking for hours, staring out the window into the quiet, dark night. That little note was like a whisper I couldn't ignore, and I knew in my soul that whoever left it was trying to save my son from something terrible. The next morning I made a decision. I didn't care what it would cost me. I was going to find out the truth no matter what. The next morning the sun came up pale and quiet, and I sat with my coffee staring at that note again, my fingers tracing the shaky words over and over. "If you love your son, tell him to check his accounts before it's too late." It felt heavier than paper, as if it carried someone's fear inside it. I kept hearing Liam's little voice in my head. "Grandma, look under the table right now. Please, sometimes children sense things long before adults do," and I wondered if somehow he had felt something that day too. I decided to start small. I didn't want to accuse anyone without knowing the truth, so I went to the bank where Daniel's joint account with Jessica was held. I knew one of the managers there, Mrs. Carter. We went to the same church years ago. She looked surprised to see me, but when I told her I was worried about some irregular transactions in my son's name, she agreed to take a discreet look. She came back after a few minutes with a concerned face. She couldn't tell me everything due to privacy rules, but she said softly, "Mrs. Miller, there have been some large withdrawals recently and a few transfers to an unknown account. Maybe you should ask Daniel about it." I thanked her and walked out, my legs weak. I knew then that something was truly wrong. That night, when Daniel came by to pick up Liam, I watched him carefully. He looked tired, older somehow, as if the joy of the wedding had already faded. I made him a cup of tea and said softly, "Honey, have you checked your accounts lately?" He looked at me surprised and said, "Yeah, a bit. Why, Mom, is something wrong?" I forced a smile and said, "Oh, nothing, just curious. You know me, always worrying." He laughed a little and kissed my forehead, saying, "You're the best, Mom. Don't stress so much." When he left, I sat there feeling torn between protecting him and telling him the truth, but I still didn't have enough proof. And if I accused Jessica and was wrong, it could break his marriage apart. I decided to wait just a little longer. Days turned into weeks, and my heart grew heavier. Each day Jessica stopped visiting. She said she was busy with work, but I knew something was off. Then one morning I got a call from Daniel, his voice low and tense. "Mom, I think someone's been taking money from my account." He said Jessica was acting strange, and when he asked her about some missing funds, she broke down crying but refused to explain. She just said she was sorry and needed time. I told him to come over right away when he arrived. He looked broken. He sat at the kitchen table just like his father used to do when life weighed on him. I handed him the note slowly. He read it 3 times, his hands shaking. Then he looked up at me and said, "Mom, where did you get this?" I told him everything, from the wedding to the moment I found it under the table to what Liam said, his eyes filled with confusion and anger, but mostly hurt. He said, "Mom, I thought she loved me." "Maybe she does," I said softly, "but sometimes love gets lost when people are scared or desperate." He nodded slowly, then said, "I'll find out the truth, I promise." The next 2 days were quiet. Daniel went about his days like a ghost, and I tried to keep Liam distracted with baking cookies and playing board games, but one evening I got a call that made my heart stop. Daniel had been in a car accident. The police said he had been driving late at night and lost control on a sharp turn. They said he was lucky to be alive, but his car was badly damaged. I rushed to the hospital trembling. When I saw him lying there pale and bruised, my heart broke. He opened his eyes weakly and whispered, "Mom, it wasn't an accident. I saw her car behind me. I tried to pull over, but she sped past and I lost control." He took a deep breath and whispered again. Jessica followed me. I don't know why, but she looked scared, not angry. Scared. My mind was spinning. How could this be happening? The woman I thought would bring peace to my son's life was now at the center of a nightmare. 2 days later, Jessica came to the hospital. She looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying. She stood at the door, clutching her purse. I wanted to yell at her to demand answers, but when she looked at Daniel, my anger softened. There was real pain in her eyes. She walked slowly to the bed and said, I'm so sorry, Danny. I never meant for this to happen. Daniel looked at her confused. What's going on, Jess? Please tell me the truth. She broke down sobbing. I didn't take the money. I swear I didn't. I was trying to protect you. Her words came out in gasps between sobs. She told us everything she had found out months earlier, that Daniel's business partner, Mark, had been using Daniel's identity to transfer funds into offshore accounts. When she confronted him, he threatened her, told her to stay quiet, or he'd ruin Daniel's name. That note at the wedding, she said it wasn't from me. It was from someone who knew what Mark was doing, one of his employees. She found me crying that day and told me she left it under the table for someone to find, but she didn't expect your grandson to notice. I felt a wave of shock. Mixed with relief and guilt, I had judged Jessica so harshly without knowing the full story. Jessica said Mark had been following her for weeks. That night she was driving behind Daniel to warn him because she thought Mark was going to hurt him. But when she saw his car crash, she panicked and drove away thinking he might hate her forever. I held her hand and said softly, we'll fix this together. Over the next few days, Daniel filed a report, and with the help of the authorities, they started investigating Mark. It turned out Jessica had been telling the truth. Mark was arrested a week later for fraud and identity theft. When it was all over, Daniel came home and hugged me tight. He said, Mom, if it weren't for Liam and that note, I don't know where I'd be today. I smiled through tears and said, sometimes God sends messages in strange ways, my son. You just have to listen. The house was quiet for days. After Daniel came home from the hospital, he moved slower than before, his steps careful, his voice softer. I could tell the SEI. Dent had left more than just bruises on his body. It had shaken his soul too. He spent long hours sitting on the porch, staring into the yard, as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. Sometimes I would bring him tea and sit beside him without saying a word. Sometimes silence is the only language that love needs. Jessica started coming around again shyly. At first, she would bring homemade soup and fresh flowers for the kitchen table. She kept apologizing over and over, saying she should have told Daniel sooner about Mark. I could see that she meant it. But Daniel stayed distant. He still loved her, but he didn't know how to trust her anymore. I understood that pain. Trust is like glass once it cracks, even when you glue it back together. The lines remain. One evening while I was washing the dishes, Liam came up to me holding a picture he had drawn. He said, Grandma, this is our family. See you, Dad, me and Mommy. I looked at it closely and saw that in the drawing he had put himself between Daniel and Jessica, his tiny hands holding them together. I smiled and felt my heart ache at the same time. Children always see what adults try to hide. After putting Liam to bed that night, I sat with Daniel. He looked tired and older than his years. I said softly, Son, sometimes forgiveness is not for them, it's for you. It's how we heal. He looked at me and said, I know, Mom, but it's hard. She hid so much from me. I said, yes, she did, but she was scared. She fought in her own way. Sometimes people make mistakes trying to protect us. He nodded slowly and said, I'll try. I don't know if I can love her the same, but I can try. That was enough for me. I reached over and took his hand, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a spark of peace in his eyes. A few months passed and things slowly started to settle. Jessica found a new job at a local school, and Daniel started a small repair business from home. It wasn't easy, but life was beginning to find its rhythm. Again, the nights grew longer. Winter crept in, and our home filled with the scent of cinnamon and coffee again. It felt like healing. But just when I thought the worst was behind us, life showed me that it still had lessons left to teach. One evening, as I was folding laundry, I heard a knock on the door. It was Jessica, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. I asked what happened, and she whispered, Mark is out on bail. I froze right there, holding a towel in my hands like it could protect me. She said the police called her earlier. He was released temporarily until trial, and she was terrified. I told her to come inside and sit down. I made her tea while my mind raced. Daniel was out picking Liam up from a school event, and I didn't want to scare her, but my heart was pounding. She said Mark had called her from an unknown number. He told her she ruined his life and that he would make her pay. I could see her hands shaking, so I held them tight and said, "Don't worry, we'll handle this together." When Daniel came home and saw her, he listened quietly as she told him everything. He didn't say much, just went to the drawer and took out his father's old revolver. He looked at me and said calmly, "Mom, I'm not letting him hurt my family again." I wanted to protest, but I could see the fire in his eyes. He was protecting what he loved, just like his father once did. That night, none of us slept. We took turns watching from the window while Liam slept peacefully in his room. The wind outside howled, and every sound made my heart jump by morning. Nothing had happened, but I could feel something coming, like a storm that hadn't broken yet. The next few days were a blur. Daniel reported the threat to the police, but they said they couldn't do much unless Mark acted on it. Jessica stayed with us for a while, and I made sure she was never alone. Liam sensed something was wrong. He asked, "Grandma, is Mommy scared?" I said, "A little, sweetheart, but she's brave and so are we." He smiled and said then everything would be okay. Then one night, just as we sat down for dinner, we heard glass shatter from the back porch. Daniel ran out, and I followed the cold air. Hit me hard. The window was broken and a brick lay on the floor, tied with a note. My hands shook as I opened it. It said, "You should have kept your mouth shut. I'll take back what's mine." We called the police and they came quickly, but Mark was nowhere to be found. They promised to increase patrols around the neighborhood and told us to stay alert. Daniel installed security cameras the next day, and I started keeping the porch light on all night. But even so, I could shake the fear. Every time the wind blew or a branch scraped the window, my heart leapt. One morning, Jessica woke up and found her car tires slashed. That was the last straw. Daniel decided to move her and Liam to a small cabin outside town for a while. He said, "Mom, you'll be safer if you stay here." I told him, "No, my place is with you. I've lost too many people in this life, and I'm not losing my family again." So we packed our things and drove out to that cabin. It was small but cozy, tucked between pine trees with a little creek running behind it. The air smelled of wood and cold water. It should have felt peaceful, but inside I was restless. I kept thinking about how one note under a wedding table had led us here, from celebration to fear, from joy to survival. Still, I refused to let fear win. I told myself I faced harder days before I raised a child alone, buried a husband, and built a life from nothing. I can face this too. Sometimes bravery doesn't roar. Sometimes it's just the quiet voice that says, "I'll keep going." That night, as I tucked Liam into bed, he asked, "Grandma, are we safe now?" I smiled and brushed his hair back. "Yes, sweetheart. We're safe, and no matter what happens, Grandma will always keep you safe." The first few nights at the cabin were quiet, too quiet. The forest around us seemed peaceful, but I could feel something in the air, a heaviness that wouldn't go away. The sound of crickets at night was almost too loud, the shadows too still. Daniel tried to stay calm for Liam's sake, but I could see the worry in his face. He checked the locks twice before bed and kept his phone next to him at all times. Jessica barely spoke. She spent most of her time sitting near the window holding a blanket and staring to the dark trees outside. I tried to make things feel normal. I cooked hot meals. I played cards with Liam. I told him stories about when his father was a little boy. Sometimes he laughed, and for a few moments everything felt almost right again. But deep inside, I knew we were holding our breath, waiting for something we couldn't name. One evening it rained for hours, the kind of rain that falls heavy and endless. The power went out and the cabin filled with shadows. Daniel lit a few candles, and we all sat near the fireplace. I made tea, while Jessica hummed softly to Liam, trying to calm him. The wind howled and the trees creaked outside. I remember thinking how fragile we all were, sitting there together, surrounded by miles of forest. Then a sound came from outside, a soft crunch, like someone stepping on wet leaves. Daniel looked at me and I looked at him. We both heard it. He grabbed a flashlight and went to the window. He whispered, "Stay here, Mom," and went out into the rain. My heart pounded. I told Jessica to keep Liam close. I stood near the door listening every second, feeling longer than the last. A few minutes later, Daniel came back soaked to the bone. He said he didn't see anyone but found footprints near the back porch. They were fresh and deep. Someone had been there watching us. I could see fear flicker in his eyes, but he tried to hide it. He said it could have been a hiker or a hunter, but I knew better. Mark was still out there and he was watching. That night, no one slept. We sat awake until the sun rose. I held Liam in my arms as he slept, his small head resting against my chest. I whispered silent prayers that morning, begging God to keep us safe, begging for strength. The next day, Daniel drove into town to talk to the sheriff. I stayed behind with Jessica and Leah, trying to keep things calm. We baked cookies and played music softly, pretending it was just another quiet day in the country. But when Daniel returned, I knew from his face that the talk hadn't gone well. The sheriff said they were doing everything they could, but without solid proof or sightings, their hands were tied. It was the same helplessness we'd been living with for months. That evening, Daniel sat on the porch, staring out at the trees. I joined him, bringing 2 mugs of hot coffee. I said quietly, "You can't keep fighting shadows forever, son." He nodded and said, "I know, Mom, but if I stop, I might lose everything I love." I said, "Then maybe it's time to stop fighting with fear and start living again. We can't let him steal our peace." Just as I said that, we heard a car engine in the distance. Daniel stood up instantly. I followed him to the window and saw headlights moving slowly down the muddy road that led to the cabin. My breath caught. The car stopped. A few yards from the house, the rain started. Again, light but steady. The engine went silent. We waited. Nothing happened for almost 5 minutes. Then the car door opened and someone stepped out, a tall figure wearing a dark jacket. I felt my knees go weak. Daniel grabbed the revolver from the drawer and motioned for us to stay back. The figure walked closer until the porch light caught his face. It wasn't Mark, it was a young woman. Daniel opened the door cautiously. She looked terrified. Her clothes were soaked and her hands trembled. She said quickly, "Please don't shoot. I know who you're hiding from. I know what he's planning." Daniel lowered the gun but didn't move closer. "Who are you?" he asked. She said, "My name is Elise. I used to work for Mark. I came to warn you." We brought her inside. She was shivering, so I gave her a towel and a blanket. She sat by the fire and said in a broken voice, "Mark's been watching you. He blames Jessica for everything," he said. "If he can't ruin your life, he'll ruin your peace. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." Jessica started crying softly. Daniel clenched his fists. I asked Elise, "What does he want?" She said, "Money, revenge, control. He wants to scare you the way he says you scared him. He told me he'd make you all pay and disappear before the trial." My heart sank, but there was something else in Elise's eyes, fear mixed with guilt. She said, "I helped him once. I didn't know what he was doing. I just filed papers, I swear. But when I realized how bad it was, I ran. I couldn't carry that guilt anymore." I thanked her for coming, for risking herself to warn us. She looked at me with tears and said, "You remind me of my own mother. I couldn't let him hurt another family like mine." That night we locked every door and window. Daniel called the sheriff again, and this time they sent 2 officers to patrol the area. Elise stayed with us, and for the first time I felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe we weren't alone anymore. Maybe the darkness was finally breaking. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, I stepped outside. The rain had stopped and the air smelled clean. The moonlight fell softly on the trees. I stood there barefoot on the porch, listening to the quiet, and I felt something shift inside me. For months I had lived in fear, waiting for the next blow. But now I realized something. I wasn't just a mother or a grandmother anymore. I was the protector of this family. Sometimes bravery doesn't come from strength. It comes from love, from the refusal to let fear take away the people you care about. That night I promised myself no matter what happened, I would stand between my family and the storm. I would not run. I would not break. The next morning began with a strange quiet. The sky was pale gray, the kind that hides the sun but doesn't rain. The forest looked calm, but I could feel tension sitting heavy in the air, like it knew what we didn't. Elise had barely slept. She kept glancing toward the window every few minutes. Jessica moved through the house like a shadow, and Daniel didn't say much. He was protecting us all. I could see that fear and anger were warring inside him. Liam was the only one who didn't feel it fully. He woke up smiling and asked if we could go fishing in the creek like we promised. I didn't have the heart to tell him no, so I said, "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart." "Okay," he nodded and ran off to play with his toy truck. I watched him and thought how precious innocence is, how fast it slips away when life shows its teeth. Around noon, Daniel decided to drive into town again to meet the sheriff. They were supposed to go over the new evidence Alice had shared. She had brought emails and bank statements she'd secretly copied before running away. They showed that Mark had forged documents in Daniel's name and stolen more than anyone knew. The sheriff had said this could be enough to put him away for good. Daniel left in his truck and I stood on the porch watching him disappear down the road. My heart ached the way it always does when a mother watches her child drive away. I whispered a small prayer for his safety, then went back inside. The hours passed slowly. The clock ticked loud against the silence. I made sandwiches, but no one was hungry. Jessica sat near the window staring at the trees. Elise paced the floor, twisting her hands. I tried to keep busy, washing dishes, straightening the blankets, anything to stop thinking. Then sometime around evening, my phone rang. It was Daniel, but his voice sounded distant. "Mom," he said, "I think someone's following me." His voice cracked like static. "I'm not sure, but I saw a black car behind me for miles." I told him to go straight to the sheriff's office, but before I could say another word, the line went dead. My knees went weak. I clutched the phone and whispered, "Daniel." "Hello, Daniel." But there was only silence. I looked at Jessica and Elise, and I didn't have to say a word. They both knew something was wrong. Jessica grabbed Liam's jacket and said, "I'm going to find him." I said, "No, you're not going alone. We're all going together." We piled into my old car and drove toward town. The road was slick from last night's rain. The trees leaned close over the road like they were listening. The sky grew darker. By the minute my hands gripped the steering wheel so tight they hurt. Halfway down the road we saw it. Daniel's truck was pulled over near the edge of the forest. Its headlights still on. My heart stopped. We pulled over and ran to it. The driver's door was open and the engine still running, but Daniel was gone. Jessica started shouting his name, echoing through the trees. Elise found a trail of footprints leading into the woods and something shiny near the path. It was Daniel's phone, cracked and wet from the mud. My stomach turned cold. I wanted to cry, but there was no time. We had to move fast. We followed the footprints into the forest. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The world shrank to the sound of our breathing and the crunch of leaves under our shoes. Then we saw a small clearing ahead, and a shadow moved between the trees. I froze. Jessica whispered, "I see him." It was Mark. He was standing near the creek, holding Daniel by the arm. Daniel looked dazed, his face bruised. Mark shouted, "You think you can ruin my life?" Daniel tried to speak, but Mark pushed him down. I wanted to scream, but fear held my throat. "Stay." Elise grabbed my arm and whispered, "We can't let him see us yet." Mark ranted for a while about how Daniel had stolen his company and how Jessica had destroyed his name. It was madness. He wasn't making sense anymore. He looked wild, like a man who had lost everything and wanted the world to burn with him. Then something shifted. Daniel looked up and saw us behind the trees. He didn't speak, but his eyes told me what to do. I nodded and stepped out from behind the trees. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would burst, but I walked forward slowly. I said, "Mark, please stop. This isn't you. You don't want to do this." He turned toward me, and for a moment I saw confusion in his eyes, like he didn't expect me to be there. He shouted, "Stay back, old woman." I said, "I won't. You've done enough already. Let my son go." He raised his arm and pointed something that glinted in the fading light. It was a gun. Jessica screamed. Daniel tried to stand, but Mark pushed him down again. Everything happened so fast. My feet moved before my mind could catch up. I stepped between Mark and Daniel and raised my hands. I said, "If you want to hurt someone, then hurt me, but leave my family alone." For a second he froze, maybe shocked, maybe moved, I'll never know, but in that heartbeat, Daniel lunged forward and knocked the gun from his hand. It fell into the mud and went off with a loud crack. The sound echoed through the forest. Mark stumbled back. Daniel tackled him to the ground. The two men struggled while Jessica ran to grab the gun. I pulled Liam close to me, crying and praying. Then the sirens came, red and blue lights flashing through the trees. The sheriff's car roared down the dirt path. They had traced Daniel's phone signal. Elise had called them before we left. The officers rushed in and pulled Daniel off Mark, pinning him to the ground. Mark screamed curses, but it was over. The officers arrested him and led him away. Daniel sat in the dirt, breathing hard, his hands shaking. Jessica fell beside him, crying. They held each other for a long time, while I just stood there, holding Liam, feeling the weight of every fear, every sleepless night lift off my chest. When it was finally quiet, Daniel looked up at me and said softly, "Mom, I'm sorry you had to see that." I knelt beside him and said, "No, son, I'm proud of you. You fought for your family. That's what matters." Elise came over, tears running down her face. She said, "It's over. He's gone for good." I hugged her and said, "You saved us. Thank you." She smiled weakly and said, "Maybe now I can forgive myself." That night we drove back to the cabin. The road looked different under the moon, softer, like it too was tired of carrying secrets. We didn't speak much on the way back. Words felt too small for what we had lived through when we finally got home. Liam ran straight to bed without a word. He was exhausted, poor child. As I tucked him in, he whispered, "Grandma, did the bad man go away?" I nodded, "Yes, sweetheart, he's gone now." He smiled and said, "Then can we go fishing tomorrow?" I laughed softly and said, "Yes, we can." The next morning, sunlight crept through the curtains, soft and golden, like a quiet promise of peace. The air felt lighter for the first time in months. Birds sang outside the cabin, and the sound made my heart ache in a good way. It was the sound of life moving forward. I stood in the kitchen making pancakes for Liam, while Jessica and Daniel slept late. They needed the rest. They had both been living in fear for so long that they had forgotten what peace even felt like. When Liam came running into the kitchen, he was smiling again. His hair was messy and his cheeks still rosy from sleep. He hugged me around the waist and said, "Grandma, can we really go fishing today?" I laughed and said, "Yes, sweetheart, we can." He ran off to find his little fishing pole, and I stood there for a moment just watching him. Sometimes happiness hides in small things like a child's laughter or the smell of breakfast on a quiet morning. Later, Daniel joined us on the porch. He looked tired but peaceful. He had dark circles under his eyes, but his shoulders weren't as heavy as before. He said softly, "Mom, I can't believe it's finally over." I said, "It's not over, son. It's just beginning. You get to live again now without fear." He smiled and nodded. I could see tears in his eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. We packed some lunch and walked down to the creek. The water sparkled in the sun, clear and calm. The world felt different, almost like it had forgiven us. The pain, the fear, the nights of waiting, it all felt far away. Now Liam threw his line into the water and shouted, "Look, Grandma, I think I caught one." I smiled and clapped for him. My heart was full. Jessica sat on the grass beside me. She looked healthier, her face no longer pale from sleepless nights. She said quietly, "You were going to lose everything." "Maggie, I really did." I looked at her and said, "You didn't lose anything that matters. You still have family love and a second chance." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She said, "You're stronger than I ever realized." I said, "No, I just love my family. That's all love makes you brave." For a while we sat there watching the sunlight dance on the water. Daniel was helping Liam untangle his fishing line, and the sound of their laughter filled the air. I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to God for giving us another day to be together. As the weeks passed, we started to rebuild our lives. Daniel decided to move back into town and start fresh. He found a small house near his new workshop and said, "Mom, I want you to live with us." I smiled and said, "I think you and Jessica deserve your own space, but I'll visit every Sunday with Pi." He laughed and said, "Deal." Jessica and I grew closer after that. I saw in her a strength I hadn't noticed before. She was still young, but she had learned the hard way how fragile life can be. One afternoon, she told me she was planning to volunteer at a women's shelter to help others going through fear and uncertainty. I told her I was proud of her and meant it. Elise testified in court against Mark. Her words helped make sure he would stay behind bars for a long time. When she called me after the trial, she said, "Thank you for not treating me like a stranger." I said, "You gave us a chance to live. You'll always have a home here." She cried quietly and said, "You sound like my mother would have if she were still alive." Months passed, the seasons changed from spring to summer, and our lives slowly began to feel normal again. Daniel's business grew. People trusted him because he was honest and kind. Jessica helped with paperwork and Liam started school. He was the happiest I had seen him in a long time. Every time he ran into the house shouting, "Grandma, I got an A on my test," I felt my heart bloom all over again. But healing isn't always easy. There were nights when I still woke up from bad dreams, when I still saw flashes of the forest and the fear in Daniel's eyes. I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the moon, and remind myself that we survived. We made it through the storm, and we did it together. One Sunday evening, we all gathered for dinner. I had cooked a big meal like I used to do years ago. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, apple pie. The table was full of laughter. Jessica teasing, Daniel, Liam showing me his drawing, and Daniel smiling quietly like a man finally at peace. As we finished eating, Liam suddenly looked at me and said, "Grandma, remember the note from the wedding?" I nodded. He smiled and said, "I think that note was from an angel." I laughed softly and said, "Maybe it was, sweetheart, maybe it was." After dinner, Daniel helped me wash the dishes. He said, "Mom, I still think about that day. Sometimes it's strange how one little thing changed everything." I said, "Life is full of little things that turn into big moments. You just have to be brave enough to face them." He nodded and said, "I think I learned that from you." When they left that night and the house was quiet again, I sat in my chair by the window watching the stars. The world outside looked peaceful. I thought about how far we had come from that day at the wedding, from the fear, the pain, the darkness, and I realized that bravery isn't about fighting. It's about staying kind, even when life isn't kind to you. It's about showing up every day, no matter how broken you feel. As I closed my eyes, I whispered a small prayer. "Thank you for the strength. Thank you for the love. Thank you for the lesson." Then I smiled because I knew that no matter what the future held, we were going to be. All right? Years have passed since that wedding day. The world has changed around me, but the memory of that moment under the table still feels as clear as yesterday. Sometimes I sit on my porch in the evening with a cup of tea and watch the sunset paint the sky in colors I can't name, and I think about how a small whisper from my grandson led to everything that came after. Liam is all grown up now. He's taller than his father, and his laughter still sounds the same bright and full of life. He comes to visit me every week. Even though he's busy with college, he brings flowers from the farmer's market and says, "Grandma, you're the strongest woman I know." And I always laugh and tell him strength is just love that refuses to give up. Daniel and Jessica are doing well. They built a life that's peaceful, honest, and full of light. Daniel's business has grown and people in town respect him not for what he owns, but for how he treats others. He's patient with everyone. And I like to think that maybe, just maybe, he learned that from watching his old mother try to hold the family together when everything was falling apart. Sometimes Jessica joins me in the garden. We plant roses and tomatoes side by side, and she tells me about the women she's helping at the shelter. She says their stories remind her of herself in the hardest days, and I tell her that healing is never wasted if it helps someone else. She smiles with tears in her eyes and says, "Maggie taught me that," and I feel something soft and proud bloom in my heart because kindness really does ripple farther than we ever see. There are nights when I still dream of the cabin, of the forest, of the fear that once gripped us all, but even in those dreams I feel peace now because I know that pain was never the end of our story. It was only the beginning of something stronger. I wake up and whisper, "Thank you" to the quiet room because I've learned that surviving is a kind of grace. Last Christmas, our whole family gathered at my house. The trees sparkled, the air smelled of cinnamon, and laughter filled every corner. Liam played carols on his guitar. Daniel roasted the turkey, and Jessica made her famous pie. I sat in my rocking chair watching them, and I thought about how far we had come. There was no more fear, only love, no more secrets, only light. After dinner, Liam came to me and said, "Grandma, I wrote something for you." He handed me a small notebook. It was filled with his handwriting. He had written down our story from the wedding to the cabin to everything that followed. He said, "I want people to know what courage looks like, not in heroes, but in real people like you who never give up. I hugged him so tight and I could feel tears slip down my face. I said, "Oh, sweetheart, courage isn't in me, it's in all of us. It's in the way we choose love, even when life breaks our hearts." Later that night, when everyone went to bed, I sat alone by the fire. The house was quiet, the lights soft, the notebook lay open on my lap. I turned to the last page and read the words my grandson had written. Grandma taught me that when you love someone, you don't let fear decide your story, you let hope lead the way. I closed the notebook and smiled. The fire crackled and I felt warmth in my chest. I looked around at the family photos on the wall and realized that love had carried us farther than I ever thought possible. The pain, the loss, the fear it had all led us here, to this moment of peace and gratitude. So when I tell our story now, I tell it not as a tale of tragedy, but as a story of courage and grace, of how a family nearly fell apart but found each other again, because one small boy whispered a secret under a wedding table and a grandmother was brave enough to listen. Life will always bring storms, but I've learned that even in the darkest nights, there's always a light waiting somewhere. Sometimes it shines through the cracks in our pain. Sometimes it hides in a child's smile. Sometimes it's in the quiet faith of an old woman who refuses to stop believing in love. If you're listening tonight and you're carrying your own pain, please know this. You are stronger than you think. You are braver than you know, and one day you will look back at your story and realize that every moment of struggle was leading you toward your strength. Because courage is not found in low, victories. It lives in the gentle hearts that keep loving through the rain, and love always finds its way home.